Amen. Oh. 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 Oh, my back has been paining me since I fell down them stairs. Oh. Oh, I won't last. I won't last. Oh. Oh. The stairs in my cottage are so narrow and so steep. I don't know what's happened. I've been up and down them stairs. Oh, I can't even count how many times. How did I manage to fall down them from top? And I won't last. I have nothing to be afeared. And I look forward to my rest with the Lord. But I know that there are so many souls still to be saved here in Englesea Brook and beyond. Oh. But I know that in the safe and capable hands of Hugh, Bourne and others like him, the primitive Methodist movement, which is in its infancy, will flourish. By the grace of God, it will. Oh! Mr. Hugh Bourne. Oh, he's an inspiration to me. An inspiration. He comes to my cottage regularly. He preaches in my kitchen. He is a wonderful man. Some would say straightforward, if you get my meaning. He suffers no fools, and some find him impatient, maybe even ungovernable and intemperate, but a more sober man you will never find. He is a difficult man sometimes, but that's because he has a zeal, a zest for the Lord, you know what I mean, a passion. Oh. He hasn't yet found out how to lay on hands. Oh. I won't last. Oh. But he preaches, but not in the charismatic style, you understand. No, he's not like his co-founder of the movement, William Clowes, who is a wonderful speaker, but Mr. Bourne is shy, timorous, like a mouse sometimes. But when the passion rises, then he is something to behold. Short and stout he is. Solid looking, you know, wears a coat that's seen many a winter and a most unfashionable hat. And he despises trousers. Oh, that is not to say that he wears nothing upon his nether regions. God forfend. No, it is, he believes that trousers are a frippery, that a distraction to the saving of souls. And so he wears breeches and stockings, like the usual labouring man. But he is a man, an inspiration to me. He was born at Ford Hayes and brought up at Bemmersley, where he still resides, I believe. And it is his mother, a godly woman, Ellen Bourne, who has instilled in him a strong Christian faith and taught him all he needs to know with reading and writing. She is a saint, not just because she, like Susanna Wesley, believes that education of her brood is most important, not just in learning but in godly ways, but she is a saint to put up with her husband. Joseph, an agricultural labourer like my husband, Robert, but not at all like my husband, Robert. Joseph Bourne, I believe, is an argumentative drunkard with very little respect for anybody or anything. I've heard that when he's in his cups, he calls on the most dreadful things, and yet when he's at home, he calls her the bishop. And he calls Hugh and his brother James the parsons. Unfortunately, Mr. Hugh Bourne has an intemperate look about him that I believe he gets from his father. But as I say, he's a sober man. But his father, Joseph, insisted that Hugh and his siblings were brought up in the Church of England. He would have nothing to do with dissenters, particularly not Methodists. He abhors the Methodists. And indeed, Mr. Hugh Bourne in his younger days abhorred them also, until, you see, he was in Macclesfield. He learnt engineering and millwrighting with his uncle. And he was working as a millwright in Macclesfield for a Quaker. And he observed these young men coming out of chapel. And the joy on their faces and the spring in their steps he had never seen before of young men coming out of church. And then he saw that it was a Methodist chapel. So he asked his employer, Quaker, if he had any books. And he borrowed them, and he read them. And he was taken, to places he'd never been before, with the simplicity of the worship and the way that all were included. And so he started to read the Arminian magazine. And then, to his horror, he found out that this was a Methodist magazine. And yet, his mother Ellen at that time was also finding her feet in a Methodist class. And she invited him along. And it was there, during a love feast, that Mr. Hugh Bourne found that the Lord was leading him to be a Methodist. Hand and heart, he said, I am a Methodist, although he was far too timid to stand up and tell anybody else about it. Now, what his father Joseph was to say to that, I have no idea. But Mr. Bourne, he comes to my cottage and he preaches here. And he preaches of his conviction of his sins, that it is by God's grace alone that he is saved. And that strikes a chord with me. I would never like to compare myself with Mr. Bourne. Oh, no. But I, too, have a strong conviction of my sin. You see, I was born at Bartonley. I never really knew my mother. I was brought up by a stepmother who paid scant attention to my behaviour. And my father, he was not a religious man, but he was upright, disliked dishonesty. But I'm afraid between the two of them, they let me run a little wild. I was a law unto myself, quick and precocious. Well, a local gentlewoman realised that what I needed was to be taken in hand. I needed an education. And so she offered to give me a rudimentary education in reading and writing, believing, I think, that once I had an education, I would be reined in. And indeed, I found reading a liberation I had never before experienced. Oh, I soon found a taste for novels of a carnal nature. And as I grew, my lust could not be sated. And I found myself singing bawdy songs and dancing. But my favourite pursuit was card playing. Even after my marriage to my husband Robert, who was an agricultural worker who at the time could neither read nor write, which was just as well, I continued in my lustful ways. We were not blessed with children, and I feared that it was my vice, that 'twas punishment from God. I was not religious, but I had this feeling within me that I was very close to the flames of hellfire. But I couldn't stop myself, you see. I couldn't. And I would pray. Like Hannah in the Bible, I would pray for a child. And then I thought my prayers had been answered because we were handed this foundling, a little boy. And I took him in, and he was like a son to me. But unlike Hannah from the Bible, I did not thank God for his good grace and hand him over to God. Instead, I kept him for myself and schooled him in my own ways. And he became as intemperate and dissolute as myself, much to the annoyance of my neighbours, who found him a terrible trouble and complained to me often. But I had no care, you see, no care at all. And then when he were 8 years old, he came down with a fever. And anything I tried would not work. I could not break it. And he never recovered. And I knew it was my punishment for the way I were. And I was beside myself with woe. And I was so angry, I railed at God. I railed at everybody and everything. And whenever I saw a woman with a child, well, my despair was just deepened. For 2 years, I slept with a bundle of his clothes. I could not let him go. Robert and the others, they said that it would all end in great sadness if I hadn't changed my ways, and now I knew that I was being punished. And I would have nightmares, night after night, waking up in a cold sweat, fearing I was being consumed by fire and rightly deserving of it. And then I was invited to a Methodist meeting at Betley, a nearby village. And I went along, and as I sat there upon the bench and listened to the preacher, who was stirring, I could see my error and my redemption. And the despair that I have been feeling for all that time dissipated. But it was not replaced by joy, as I hoped. No. It was replaced by a greater despair. A despair of my eternal soul was being lost. And I wrestled with this week after week, and week after week I sat in that chapel and I listened to them preachers. And then one Sunday, one of them said it was our Christian duty to not allow any souls to fall into decay. And I realized I must not allow my neighbors and my husband's soul to be as decayed as mine. And so I asked the preacher if he would come to my cottage and give them his message. For I had an idea I would invite them round to hear it. but he was unable. And he sent a man by the name of Thomas Woodnorth in his stead. Now, Thomas Woodnorth had joined with the Primitive Methodists. This was 1811. Of course, they were not yet known as the Primitive Methodists. That was a year later when the name was taken. And he came to my cottage, and I invited my neighbours, and he spoke to us about God's grace and forgiveness. And you know, that night, many of my neighbours and Robert, my husband, they were convicted of needing God's grace. Praise the Lord. And soon we were gathering together, my neighbours and myself and my husband, and every Sunday in a small class meeting. And that is when the sainted Hugh Bourne came to my cottage to preach. And that was when I knew that I was at last doing God's will. And listening to him, I understood that I was forgiven. I could not turn back the clock, but I knew that I had work to do. And so I started to invite the local children into my home, and I was teaching them reading and writing. And then I began to teach them to pray and to preach from the Bible, and I allowed them to lead the prayers with the other adults. You see, I didn't want their souls to decay like my boys had done. And Mr. Bourne, well, he congratulated me. He said he loved to talk to the young children and to preach to them, and to bring them to Christ was the greatest thing that we could do. Well, soon my class meeting grew too large for my little cottage. My husband, Robert, he has a relative who lives over the lane by the name of William Salmon, a maltster and farmer. And he said that we could meet in his malt kiln house. We could push away the barrels and the trestles, and we could have our meetings and our love feasts there. And what a wonderful time our love feasts were. You will note that I am now speaking in the past tense. I told you I would not last, and I have not. I tumbled down my stairs in April 1822. By June, I was unable to get to my feet and took to my bed. And then on July the 8th, without a groan, I fell asleep. The church said that their loss was my infinite gain, and so it is. Of course, the Primitive Methodist movement carried on without me. I'm not important, really. Just a small finger, really, in the great body that movement was becoming. Mr. Bourne and Mr. Clowes, well, they carried on. Well, Mr. Clowes was the other great shepherd, the other great founder of the movement. And you know, I was very interested to hear that he too had a carnal lust for dancing. He would dance his way through all the wakes. Indeed, he danced his way all the way up to Hull. And then, while he was in his cups, He had to dance away from a press gang. And so terrified was he that he sped back down to Burslem, near Stoke, for he was a potter from Tunstall. And he realised that if he didn't change his ways, well then, he would be set adrift, quite literally. Never mind the press gang. So that is when he was converted, you see. Now, Mr. Bourne believed in field preaching, not just in preaching in cottage kitchens. No, he believed, for having read in the books that his mother Ellen had given him, that the Methodists had at one time preached in the open air. And he had wondered at that time why the Methodists no longer did it. And they said, well, it was not meet to meet in the open air. Large gatherings, no, the authorities would not like it. And the Methodists were becoming very respectable. But Mr. Bourne knew that that was where he had to go to meet the people. You see, he was a labourer himself, although he was a very educated man by his own efforts. But he knew that he had to go to the coalface, out into the fields. He had to go to the kitchens. He had to go to the factories. He had to give God's grace to all whom he met, show them the love of Christ where they were. And as a result, he was thrown out of the Methodist Church, as was Mr. Clowes. And so, the movement grew. He took more and more people along with him. And what a man he was. He would walk up to 50 miles a day to tell the message of the good news of Christ. And in his pocket he would have a bit of bread and a couple of boiled eggs to sustain him. No fripperies, you see, no trousers, and very little lunch. And Englesea Brook, it was growing too. Soon Mr. Salmon's malt kiln house was far too small. The little class that I myself had started had grown into a congregation, and so Mr. Salmon said they could have a parcel of land to build a chapel. And the chapel was erected in the year of our Lord, 1828. Of course, I never lived to see it. But just 4 years later, it had to be extended. Isn't that wonderful? Oh, so many wonderful things were happening. And Mr. Bourne was travelling further and further, and Mr. Clowes had skipped all the way back up to Hull. He'd been called to start a mission there and throughout Yorkshire. The connection was now growing. They were known as the Primitive Methodists, and they were still preaching out in the fields. For, of course, the first camp meeting, which was a very great occasion, which I remember myself, was in 1807 at Mowcop, when the wonderful Lorenzo Dow from North America came to preach. Nothing could stop Mr. Bourne and his associates from continuing this. And Mr. Bourne, he encouraged children in every way to pray and to preach. And the Sunday schools sprung up. And he didn't just teach them reading and writing, but arithmetic and science, for Mr. Bourne was a man of science, an engineer. Oh, and he loved modern inventions. How he loved the steam engine. I myself never travelled on a steam train, but I believe they can go above 12 miles an hour. Now that would take my breath away, if I had any. But Mr. Bourne, he loved steam engines and steam trains. And when he had to go a distance, he would travel on one. And he would teach the children and the adults these things. For he believed that science was God's gift to us. And there was something else that Mr. Bourne did. which I thought was wonderful. You see, he'd been to hear a woman by the name of Elizabeth Evans of Derbyshire preach. And he was so moved by her knowledge of Scripture, that he really believed that women had an extraordinary call to preach from God. And he encouraged women as much as he could. Now, there was one such woman by the name of Sarah Kirkland, and she was just 18 years of age when Hugh Bourne came across her. And he could see that she was a godly woman who had a real gift. A tiny woman, much smaller than me. And at just 18 years of age, she was the first woman to be put on the Primitive Methodist preaching plan in 1814. And Mr. Bourne paid her 2 guineas a quarter out of his own pocket, which was half that of a man, to go out and preach on the road, travel like he did. And she became known as the travelling preacheress. And people would come from miles around to hear her, for she was such a curiosity, such a tiny woman, with such a big passion. There was a report that in 1817 she was preaching in a barn in Nottinghamshire. And this young man and his companion travelled many, many miles to see her. And when they got to the barn, there was no room at the inn, so to speak. Well, when they eventually got inside, they could not see her, even though she was standing upon a cart for her pulpit. And so they found a ladder, put it up against the roof beam and climbed up. And there they had a wonderful picture of the wonderful Sarah Kirkland, who stirred them. Well, she, after about 4 years, she came off the road, for her husband had died. But she did not stop preaching. She became a local preacher then, and she continued preaching for 63 years. Now, not many women stayed on the road above 2 years, it must be said, for it was a very hard life. Often, they had their children in tow. Some of them would breastfeed their children in the pulpit before the sermon. Now, the congregation were not shocked by this. Indeed, they were warmed by it, for it was a picture of real beauty, like the picture of God cradling us in his arms, like a babe. That was at first, in the early days, I must say. But it was hard for the women. As I say, there were long distances to walk, and there was much opposition from the authorities and from the Wesleyan Methodists, as they had become known. You see, they had phased out women preaching, as they did not think it meet. And when they would stand up in the marketplaces, they were often pelted with rotten fruit, vegetables and eggs and dead cats. They were threatened with violence and arrested. But whenever a preacher was arrested in the marketplace, another would step up and take their place. Many of them became local preachers after a while and continued in that vein. But from the 1840s, Mr. Hugh Bourne and Mr. Clowes's authority was waning somewhat. Many people did not like Mr. Bourne's approach. As I said before, he was a straightforward man, could be impatient, said what he thought. They didn't like his bluntness. He was a great organiser, but they didn't like to be bossed. And you see, he and his brother James had also bought a printing press and installed it at their farm in Bemsley. And he was the editor of the Primitive Methodist magazines, both for adults and children. And he had control over all sorts of things and even wrote many of the articles. And they didn't like that either, as the connection grew. And so in 1844, Mr. Hugh Bourne packed his chest, got on a boat at Liverpool and sailed across the ocean to Canada and North America. He was a man in his 70s. Can you believe it? That he felt that he would be more use there than back here. After all he'd done, he'd worn out his feet with walking for the Lord, and that's how they paid him. Well, Mr. Clowes went to be with the Lord in 1851, and Hugh Bourne followed the year after. And that is when the Primitive Methodist movement became respectable. I am not saying we were not respectable before. Temperance and sobriety were markers of our kind, I'll thank you. I burned all my carnal novels when I found the Lord. No, what I mean is they became respectable in the way of the age. Women, for example, were now the angels of the hearth. It was not meet for a woman to climb into the pulpit and preach to men. Instead, the women were encouraged into the schoolrooms and into the missions. Just as the Wesleyan Methodists had phased out women preachers, so the Primitive Methodists were doing the same. And the movement was growing, you see. And so, out of necessity, many more chapels were built. The 1860s was a great time of chapel building, and these became ever more conventional and filled with pews, ornate pulpits and organs. And so it continued to the end of the century. And by then there was no more itinerant female preachers. And the last of the women preachers were dying out too. It's not to say they were not called by God to preach, but now the men were wearing their top hats, not their flat caps. Now they were wearing trousers. It had become respectable and attractive to the new middle classes. When the Primitive Methodists celebrated their centenary in 1907 at Mowcop, when they celebrated that wonderful occasion of that first camp meeting, when thousands came to the Lord, there was not a single woman upon the carts to preach. Of course, in 1914, women had to then climb back into the pulpits. Not just in the Primitive Methodist chapels, but in the Wesleyan chapels also. I don't know if you've heard, but there was a terrible war that started in 1914. I'm just glad that I was not alive to see it, for it decimated the male population, I believe. And the Primitive Methodists recognised that actually women had a place, that what Mr. Hugh Bourne had seen in women was indeed an extraordinary calling. And so female preachers, once again, became commonplace, shall we say. And then at conference in 1931, an extraordinary happening. The conference voted unanimously for the ordination of women. Ordination of women? In my day, we didn't even have the ordination of men in the Primitive Methodist Church. But isn't that wonderful? That favourite scripture passage of Mr. Bourne that was quoted by the Apostle Peter from Joel on the day of Pentecost, that our sons and daughters shall prophesy. It seemed that it was about to come true in the most wonderful way. However, a year later, the Wesleyans, the Prims, the Independents, and all the other branches of the Methodist Church came together in union. And ordination of women was a step too far for the Wesleyans. And they would have to wait another 30 or 40 years. But what a difference we made. Not just us women, but the children as well. And we were encouraged, you see. We were encouraged. We were a movement that started around the farmhouse tables, in the cottages by the hearths, at the pits, in the fields and in the factories. And Mr. Bourne was the one who educated us, empowered us, encouraged us to learn, to better ourselves through education. And it worked. For so many of us were pulled up and became preachers. We had the confidence to stand up, not just to preach the word of the Lord, but to preach justice for all people. And so from the ranks of the Prims came trade union leaders, members of parliament, suffragettes, socialists. From the Prims, and indeed the other parts of the Methodist Church, it must be said, came the temperance movement, the cooperative society. Oh, so many things. And today, you have so much equality, diversity, and inclusivity. These are all words I have learnt. And they are wonderful words. And that's what Mr. Bourne gave us. He gave us words. He gave us the courage and the ability to form them and understand them and use them. And I look back at my humble beginnings at the beginning of the century, all those years ago. And he encouraged me. He said, "Well done, Sarah. Well done, sister." Of course, I never lived to see so much good that had come from the movement, which, like me, is now consigned to history. But I know that it will go on in people's hearts, what was placed there by the Venerable Hugh Bourne. And my little cottage, it still stands there at Englesea Brook. Holly Cottage it's called, as does the chapel I never lived to see. And who do you think is buried in the graveyard opposite the chapel? No, not me. Mr. Hugh Bourne. You see, he loved to come to Englesea Brook so much, and his niece Anne married William Salmon's son, William. And she lived there at Manor Farm. And Mr. Bourne would come to her often to have his poor swollen feet seen to, and she would put leeches from the brook upon his feet to ease the swelling. And there he rests at Englesea Brook. And you can see his memorial, and what a fine memorial it is, erected by his nieces. And you will read the inscription upon it, and it will tell you that at the time of his death in 1852, there were over 100,000 adherents to primitive Methodism. In just 50 years, he managed that. It is quite remarkable. But if you really want to know about his legacy, you should have seen his funeral procession. It started at Bemersley, his home, wound its way through Tunstall, through Audley, down the lanes to Englesea Brook, and along the way Sunday school scholars and many, many people lined the streets and gathered behind his coffin, raising their voices in hymns of praise. Up to 20,000 good souls that day followed him to his resting place. So you see, he was well loved, if a little troublesome, and straightforward, even if he did wear an unfashionable hat and no trousers. Well, I must rest now. But I know that that flame that I felt, not the hellfire, but the flame, like the Pentecostal flame that grew inside me through knowing Mr. Bourne and others, and knowing my Saviour, that transformed my life. It transformed my despair and woe into true joy. And although I was dead and buried at 56 years of age, all thanks to my stairs, I know that flame will continue. For my transformed life transforms lives today. And my prayer is that there will be many, many more millions of transformed lives until the day of ultimate transformation for all of us. A day I know will be one of true glory, when all the saints like Hugh, Bourne and the like will rise, and we will come together singing praise and hymns to the glory of God. But for now, the peace and quiet of Englesea Brook, where grace abounds, the brook babbles and the wind softly sighs through the trees, is still my home. And it would be lovely if you could come and visit it and share the peace and break bread. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. You have a wonderful gift. I'm sure we've all got a wonderful picture now of Englesea Brook and all the women that have helped to make it so. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful.
Thank you very much.
You.
Follow that, as they say. We've had a brilliant day, haven't we? Exhausted? Yeah, I thought everybody might be tired. So just to bring us towards the sleeping time of the day, just be quiet for a moment or two, and then we'll have a short devotion before we either wake up again or wend our way towards bed. So just a moment to be quiet. And I've brought us around almost full circle, returning to some of the thoughts about birds that we picked up on earlier. And I'm going to read just a few verses from Isaiah chapter 40, 28 to 31. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired and weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Wouldn't that be nice? I wonder whether you've ever watched a murmuration of starlings. It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? There are just a few images of some up on the screen there. Thousands of birds sometimes, whirling, twirling, turning, swooping. You wonder how on earth they're going to miss one another, and you're kind of waiting anxiously to see if somebody's going to bump or push or fall out of the sky. But they never seem to, do they? Amazing acrobatics. The sight of them is quite mesmerizing. You can't stop watching them. It's so enthralling. It brings out those feelings of wonder and awe that we often hear about, but sometimes perhaps don't quite fill us with the full meaning of them. Those birds seem to be having such fun, showing off their flying skills. Such energy. It's phenomenal. And they don't appear to become tired. But this usually happens around dusk, just as the day is turning from night into the darker times. Of course, not all bird species behave like this. It's a speciality of starlings. And perhaps they're not the most popular birds when they're on the ground, because they can be rather pushy with smaller species. They're not the most, perhaps, attractive birds when you see them in the garden or out in the field. But if you take the time to look closely at them, their feathers are iridescent, absolutely beautiful individually, and on their backs catching the light. Just beautiful. Now, I'm very fortunate. I live in a place where we have many birds. They visit our garden regularly. We have 20 or more species that come very regularly, and others that come as the seasons change and the birds migrate back and forth. And we love watching them. And we pick up the local characters, get to recognize the individuals, see their characteristic movements. Not so good at recognizing their songs, get those rather confused. But we watch them. We watch the woodpecker shuffling its way up the lime tree, pecking its way back down again. We watch the robin, who regularly is in the garden, and that flitting sort of flight that they have as they go across, and then sitting on a perch just watching the world go by and seeing what life is like. The goldfinches like to vie with one another and take up time eating off from the feeders that we often put out. The jay, as soon as he arrives, the small birds suddenly disappear. And the blue tits and the great tits kind of line up along a branch or atop of the fence, waiting their turn to come swooping down on the feeders. Quite often in the summertime, in the evening, when we finished our jobs for the day, we'll sit in the conservatory and just watch the birds and listen to them. And then all of a sudden, with no apparent clue that it's happening, everything goes silent. It just stops. The birds are not there anymore. No sound, no singing. They've gone to roost. But it happens very suddenly, just as the light must tip into the darkness. Now, as far as we know, birds don't have long memories. Although one might wonder how they learn and remember how to fly, how they learn to avoid obstacles, how they know where there are places to find food, to locate the best places to nest. And I wonder, do they hope? In Luke 12, verse 24, it tells us that the ravens do not reap or sow, and yet the Lord feeds them. Do they just have a simple trust that they will be fed? I note that they have to put some effort, generally, into finding food, because even when we feed them, they're often chasing one another around, waiting their turn, vying with one another to get the best bits of the food that's left. And so what about us? What's for us? You might perhaps make some comparisons to the different kinds of characters of people, the different attitudes, the different sizes, the different shapes that we all have amongst us. And if we compare ourselves to kinds of birds, I wonder what kind of bird you might be. We appreciate their agility in the air, the beauty of their plumage. But the birds all have at least one thing in common. They are all fed in nature by the abundance of creation. The creation that we believe has been provided by God. And we can learn a good deal by watching those birds, engaging with their needs, feeding them when necessary, conserving the places where they like to need and to nest and to breed. At this time in our world, there are many people who are weary. The pandemic, changes in climate, bringing too hot, too cold, too dry, too wet, a rise in aggression that seems to be amongst us, powerful megalomaniacs and the ways that they affect our day-to-day living in one way or another. And yet the Bible tells us that God, who never grows weary, will provide the necessary strength and power if we hope in the Lord. And then we can soar on eagle's wings. Doesn't that sound amazing? Let's sing. Hymn 455 in Singing the Faith. All my hope on God is founded.
Oh
and a prayer to take us towards the night. Loving and gracious God, as we approach the coming night, we hold the memories of this day and yesterday in our minds. We thank you for guiding us here, for the affirmations of faith, the new learning, the conversations and laughter, the help through the little challenges that living brings. May this night bring calm to our minds with affirmation of faith, rest to our bodies, refreshing us with strength and enthusiasm for tomorrow, assurance that you are always with us in all our joys and all our trials. May our hearts belong to you, and may we know that in following you, we will not fall. The hope for us is in you. Amen. So, enjoy your night. If you are watching the film, we will continue in here in a little while when we've got the film going. And if you're going with Gillian to do some dancing, I think you're in room 3. So, good night, everybody.